Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of four conversations organized by the Department of Architecture at the UVA School of Architecture, revolving around the topic of towards an architecture of confluence. The theme of the lecture series specifically focuses on work that exemplifies architecture's ability to bring together multiple, often competing stakeholders in order to achieve a meaningful spatial synthesis. And I think in the context of many discussions about sort of architecture and issues of conflict that we've been having recently and very well-deserved conversations, I think it's also important to remember on about architects and design's ability to bring people together, to actually create sort of conditions of confluence. And I cannot think of anyone better to open these conversations than our friends from Interboro Partners, composed of Tobias Armborst, D'Oca and Georgeen Theodore. Shortly after meeting in graduate school in the early 2000s, Interboro was founded as an office that would look beyond the specific achievement and effectively bridge across the many disciplines that make up the planning and design of the built environment. With training in art, architecture, urban design, and urban planning, this trio is always looking beyond siloed discipline conventions and examining with a gimlet eye the many audiences and publics that influence the shape of cities, giving them a voice in urban planning. This has resulted in a practice that is prolific at building consensus while still retaining a sense of authorship. A practice where the planning process is equally important as the outcome itself. This is evident throughout their body of work, from small-scale installations to regional plans to writing commissions. Additionally, Tobias, Dan, and Georgeen have extended many of these ideas at Vassar, Harvard GSD, and the New Jersey Institute of Technology, respectively, breaking down disciplinary silos that continue to be very present in contemporary education. On a more personal note, Tobias, Dan, Georgeen, and I have been friends for close to 20 years now. We're aging ourselves here. The first practice that I actually officially invited to lecture in my academic career was Interboro. More than 15 years ago, when of course I had less gray hair and more hair in general, and they mesmerized the audience with a phenomenal project for Detroit. One that in a very inventive way aggregated vacant lots to existing houses, giving a new lease on life to undervalued land. I am absolutely delighted that we can continue this dialogue a decade and a half later, this evening with even a more impressive body of work. Georgeen, Dan, and Tobias, welcome to UVA.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Felipe. And thank you to the school. Thank you to Dean Berman for having us here tonight, this evening. We hope everyone's healthy and safe. And Felipe, yes, it's true. I think one of our very first invited lectures was the one that we did with you. We just started our firm. We just won our first competition. So it's really wonderful to be here with you tonight and to kind of, I don't know, bring the band back together, so to speak. And also on a personal note, it's really nice for me, some of the people that I had as my first professors when I was an undergrad are at UVA, like Bill Sherman and Peter Waldman. So it's really extra nice to be here tonight with you all. And Tobias, Dan, and I, we really love the way that you framed this series and with the name, you know, Towards an Architecture of Confluence. And we thought we could use, or that we could show you how we have been using the tools of architecture and planning to bring different groups to the same table, so to speak. And so we're calling this talk Table of Contents. And we'll show you what we've been working on and thinking about. And hopefully we'll have some time to discuss and make this a bit more conversational. So what do we do? As you said, we're architects. Yep, in the second slide, right. Can you guys hear me okay? Everything's good? Okay, thank you. So we're architects, planners, urban designers with offices in Brooklyn and Detroit. And our projects are almost exclusively projects for the public realm. And certainly the public realm is where the big questions are for architecture at this moment, even if it certainly may not be where the big budgets are for architecture at this moment. But who has access to space has been a question that has always been the focus of our work. But with the COVID crisis and the Black Lives Matter movement, questions of who has access to public space, who can safely occupy public space, and even who has the resources to choose not to be in public space have been recast and now are understood as questions of life and death. So we'd like to, in this kind of framing, we'd like to focus on two aspects of our work, namely one, our urban research work, specifically with our ongoing project, the Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion, and some of our recent design and planning work, which is of course deeply informed by that research work, sometimes in obvious and sometimes in less obvious ways. So we have the Arsenal on the one hand and the planning and design work on the other. And these two aspects of our practice that speak to two modes of operating, one reflective, investigative urbanism, say on the one hand, and projective planning and design practice on the other. So reading and making. And at the outset, we'd like to stress how these two modes of working as urbanists can, and in our view, should be closely linked. And we think this is really an important point at a time when in urban practice, there still really is this really big gap between, let's say, a detached critical academic planning discourse and largely unreflective market-driven urban design practice.
So let's begin with the first part, our research work, which is really what we started out with as a practice in those old days, almost 2 decades ago. The two very first projects we did together as an office, and that Felipe knows well from that presentation, were about urban research, right? So it was really about research, but in a very empirical, observational way. This was really detective work of sorts. So we looked closely at a dead mall, trying to find microscopic traces of life in this abandoned, in and around this abandoned structure as clues for potential future redevelopment. And we looked at, as Felipe mentioned, Detroit, the residential neighborhoods in Detroit, looking closely at what residents were actually doing with their properties. This was at a time when the big narratives about Detroit were very much about abandonment and the rebirth of the spectacular rebirth of a city, but behind in the downtown, but behind these big stories, there were hidden almost or obscured by those larger narratives. There were everyday spatial practices of Detroiters who were expanding their properties by buying, taking, or borrowing adjacent land, and thereby forming new patterns of land ownership and new models of land tenure. We thought it was really interesting, even though it was really dealing with the small scale and with observation. We thought it was interesting because it spoke to radical transformation of a city, change of a city's genetic code, but a change or transformation that was not driven by large design visions or top-down visions of transformation, but by those small-scale, pragmatic, everyday practices of people who were working tactically on the ground based on their desires to improve the immediate environment around them. Practices like that one can find only when operating with a degree of humility and patience, and that was really what we, how we operated as researchers here, looking closely, talking to people, listening, suspending judgment for a while to see what people do in a city and with a city and what we can perhaps learn from it. How people adjust cities to their needs, urban spaces, sidewalks, streets, and how some new spaces and new meaning emerges in the process. Here, this is a more recent example, but also one from Detroit, another observation in a neighborhood that we're working in and been working on for the last 2 years, namely Bangalore. And here's sort of a small, minimal architecture, but a space that really transforms what is the space between the two bungalows, right? The building setback, so a space that's defined by zoning codes, here temporarily is transformed in preparation for a wedding into this incredibly festive space of entry, a gateway, with the help of really minimal architecture. So temporary adjustment, tactical, creative acts that temporarily create new meaning in the built environment, an urban space that is adjusted in this way, in this bottom-up incremental way, using lightweight props. So those are the kind of things that people do with cities that we're really interested in, right? Because they're transformative, and they're implicitly, we could say, empowering, right? People taking charge of their environment by making new meaning with the help of architecture, we could say, small-scale architecture. So that's what a lot of our urban research work is about, these kind of tactical bottom-up transformations of urban space using architecture. But not all of those transformations of urban space are necessarily empowering, right? Here, for example, we see another scene from Detroit, another story that is about tactical appropriation of urban space, the creation of new meaning in the built environment with light architecture, but one that is not about empowerment, but about division.
So a little more about this, the story of the shed. So here we are on the border between Detroit and the suburb of Grosse Pointe Park, and you can see the extreme racial and economic divide if you look at the demographics. This is one of those invisible borders in American metropolitan areas that, while invisible, really has a huge impact on the life chances of people on either side of the divide. So if you look at the demographics on either side in terms of race, in terms of income, so you can see, and I'm not going to go over the demographics, but it's an invisible border in a way. But recently, it's actually becoming less and less invisible as Grosse Pointe Park on the right started fortifying this border kind of under the radar and doing these kind of tactical things as a means of keeping Detroiters on the left side from entering Grosse Pointe Park. And they're doing it kind of under the radar in a way that they won't have to admit to it. So for example, the sanitation department moves snow into the middle of the street. As you can see that second from the top, and here's a picture of it. There's a lot of snow in Detroit in the winter, and while the thought of a giant snow pile in the middle of the street might seem strange, here it is. It's dumped right in the middle of the street, so people coming from Grosse Pointe Park people going from Detroit can't get to Grosse Pointe Park. It's a de facto barrier. And then the shed, which we saw a picture of earlier, which was built right in the middle of the street, like the snow pile. If you ask Grosse Pointe Park what this is, they'll say it's a shed for a farmer's market, part of a plan to create a more walkable community that appeals to young white-collar professionals. So here it is from the Grosse Pointe Park side. You were just looking at it from the Detroit side. So, the idea was to put a farmer's market in there. And, so this is what it looks like today. And it's kind of interesting how things that people can't be against, like a farmer's market or fresh food, or if you go one more slide, art. This is actually what it looks like today. There's a lot of controversy around it, and they had to take down the shed, but they were still able to keep the street narrow and put this kind of public art piece there. So amazing how these things like art and public space and fresh food, how these things are kind of weaponized, right? And they acquire new meaning and kind of become weapons of exclusion. And a good example, I think, of the pathetic, but also kind of creative ways in which people try to make walls without having to be so explicit about it. Not that you need to be under the radar these days, but we'll talk about that in a minute. This is an interesting piece of architecture, and there are historical examples of this as well. So what we're looking at here is another kind of political artifact, also in Detroit. This is called the Burwood Wall. It's a pretty unremarkable artifact in itself until you understand why it's there. So it's kind of a remnant from the 1940s when a developer wanted to build a all-white middle-class subdivision on a site which happened to be located adjacent to an older African-American neighborhood. And because the site was in mixed-race territory, the Federal Housing Administration didn't insure mortgages to the subdivision until the developer built this wall. And then the FHA said that it was okay, and they insured mortgages within the subdivision. So here, perhaps more than the actual barrier, this wall, this kind of physical embodiment of racist mortgage policies. So, in the next slide, you see these kind of two political artifacts side by side, one from the present, one from the past, both from the same city. They're kind of Rosetta Stones, right, whose markings reveal attitudes about who has the right to be where, when, and for how long. So artifacts like these, along with the policies, rules, and regulations that shape them, are the topic of a book we wrote called The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion. So it's really a field guide to what we call weapons of exclusion and inclusion, the codes, conventions, rules, practices, artifacts, these things that shape the space of the contemporary city, and in particular, public space, making it either more accessible or more closed off to different people, often based on who those people are and what they look like. So I think we have 163 weapons in this book. They're all hidden in this illustration. And in the book, we kind of look at how they've been used by different actors in the United States to either restrict or increase access to urban space. We also speculate about how they might be deployed or retired to make more open cities in which more people feel welcome in more spaces. So each of these weapons has a definition and a short article. This is the entire list, or almost the entire list. We edited it quite a bit, but still ended up with 163. They're written by us, some urban historians, practitioners, sociologists, scholars of law, scholars of science. So the weapons include built objects like the wall and the shed that we just saw, everyday objects such as armrests on public benches, which I think you'll see on the next slide, to keep people from sleeping on them. There are rules and policies like camping ordinances, as you see here, that, like the armrests, are trying to prevent people from resting in public space. We could say the same about the sidewalk management plan. In the arsenal are weapons that deny access to parts of the city directly through barriers. Here's a photograph, by the way. This is a photograph by Tim Davis, a photographer who took a lot of pictures of the different weapons for the book. Next. Tools that deny access to parts of the city directly or through barriers, or indirectly through, for example, residential parking permits in very car-dependent cities like Los Angeles. Tools can ban certain kinds of behavior in public space, either directly or through things like no loitering signs, or indirectly through things like classical music, piped in through outdoor speakers, or like as you see here, to frighten off skateboarders. But then in the book, there are also counter tools, namely those that increase access to the city. There are policy tools like inclusionary zoning, but also newer things like aging improvement districts, community land trusts, more inventive things like this map, which you see on the next slide, which was made by a group called the Los Angeles Urban Rangers. It's a map that kind of informs people about how to gain access to the incrementally privatized public beaches in Malibu, and so on and so forth.
So since we started working on this project back in 2008, it's taken on many forms. In addition to the book, as Dan described, we've done a number of exhibitions, conversations, and other publications. The book is currently sold out, but the second edition is on its way. And as we were kind of preparing the new preface over the past couple of months, we were discussing which of the many tools in the book have become more or less important. And many of the exclusionary impulses that were once kind of subtly camouflaged, like the farmer's market that Dan just explained, they're now blurted out pretty openly. Like, for example, when the president talks about affordable housing in the suburbs and so on. And like I said before, the question of access to the public realm has taken on a few turns. The COVID pandemic has thrown into sharp relief how vulnerability aligns with race, class, and income. And suddenly the absence of from public space has become a measure of care for others. So it's really sort of flipping things on their head. And then also how the protests following the murder of George Floyd really demonstrate the importance of people's physical presence in the public realm. And so in these struggles and conflicts, the design of urban space is always political. Architecture and urban design aren't neutral bystanders. So this is really a key message of the arsenal of exclusion and inclusion. And so one of the reasons why we wrote the book was really to better understand our own agency as practitioners. And so the goal of our research is really to better understand the people and forces that act on architecture, not only because we find that really interesting, but also really to understand our own ability as designers to act within this network, to better understand urban planning and design's roles, responsibilities, complicity, but also the sometimes surprising agency that we have vis-a-vis these different actors and forces, and also to really pick and define the causes and clients that we want to work for. And so with this kind of mindset of the arsenal, what are some of the things that we end up making? We'd like to show you 3 aspects of our work dealing with the public realm, the design of public spaces, planning processes, and the design of tools to make these planning processes more public.
Okay, to start out with the public spaces, so what we've done over the past decade or so is that we've built a number of public spaces, some temporary, some for clients with limited resources, often therefore as a result really incorporating alternative economies such as borrowing, bartering, gift exchange, really often taking inspiration from some of the everyday practices that we identified in Detroit and other places. What makes working with such limited resources interesting is that the design project is also always a process of negotiating and coalition building, negotiating with different actors and involving different processes of exchange. So for example, just to run through a few of those projects we've done over the last couple of years, Land Space, Sculpture Park that doubled as a tree nursery for an arts organization on a downtown New York site that was temporarily vacant while being rezoned. It's also a temporary park that we did, a rest stop, a small temporary park on the Lower East Side in New York, where we worked with community organizations and an almost non-existing budget, forcing us to making a project that was entirely out of recycled material and borrowed material, borrowed trees on their way from the nursery to their final sites. Similar exchanges going on in Venice, where we made the American Pavilion accessible and created this temporary space for conversation and for play on a tiny budget, really, by borrowing material from the city of Venice. So you see some of the different constellations here. You see the play going on. These are the things that we borrowed from the city of Venice. You might know those temporary sidewalks for Acqua Alta that weren't used during that time. And so we were able to use that as building material, and in exchange gave seeding elements to the city afterwards. So those kind of negotiation projects are often necessary, but also interesting in that they set up the project not only as a built space, but also as a process of negotiation, setting up. This was actually a project that started as a parklet for the city, or a series of parklets for the transportation department of the city of Boston. We designed these blocks that can form different parklets, but that also then later on acquired a new meaning as when they were acquired by the New York City Health Department to set up temporary stations for events, but also set up what is now called friendship benches that are street corner public spaces for peer-to-peer mental health consultation. Here is a series of experimental public spaces we did for the Harvard campus. So we worked with our Harvard Common Spaces to set up a series of seasonal spaces, most recently the shade structure that came with the kind of challenge to create the equivalent of what is the tree canopy shade, a filter for the light without adding additional weight on top of a plaza that was not made for this sort of structure, and using some of the existing foundations. So this was negotiating not so much human actors, but the forces here on this site. So another social space, campus social space here at Vassar, which is about setting up a social space for student life on a campus that doesn't have much of those, or I didn't have much of those. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is our most recent project along these lines. This is a very small installation just finished in the South Bronx, where we've been working for the New York City Department of Health. And it actually started out as a placemaking study. And here we began by talking with many different residents and stakeholders in the South Bronx. And we identified a couple of priority projects to improve public spaces that were in line with the Department of Health's mission for like improved health by increasing walkability and access to healthy food. But one of the things that we discovered early on in this process, which you can see in this, this map here, is that many of the residents were extremely vulnerable to heat. And in New York City, when we have these heat waves, the indoor cooling centers are really of crucial importance. And this is important, particularly for vulnerable senior citizens. But next slide. During the current pandemic, almost all of these cooling centers have been closed, or they've reduced their capacities. Like the one that you can see outlined here in the blue, that's at the Hunts Point Library. And so as a prototype for a low-tech outdoor alternative to these indoor cooling centers, we've developed a cooling station here in this plaza. It's this, you can kind of see it here as this long linear element. It's a 100-foot bench that has shade, movable seating, outdoor fans, and nozzles spraying fine mists of water. So next slide. This is the plaza before. And this is again like refers to the kind of observation and empirical analysis that Tobias was talking about, where we saw people were actually sitting on this ledge. But instead of like putting some kind of pop-up tent in the middle of the street, we built on those practices that we found there, and then bundled all of these different cooling elements along that, that line. So here you can see the bench in section at the top with the fans and the mist. And then the next, you can see it, next slide, you can see it over the summer in action. And then next slide, here in elevation, it was really heavily used by not only kids, but really a lot by the residents of the adjacent senior center. And we asked some of them what the project should be called, and Celeste, who you can see on the right, she's kind of the de facto mayor of the street. She proposed refreshing water, and that's now what the project is called.
Real quick, so as a second installation as part of this project, something we're calling the concrete connection. And so it's a mural that bridges a particularly strong psychological threshold across train tracks and a highway between a dense residential neighborhood and a park. So it features portraits of community members kind of reenacting their favorite park activities at home during COVID. And so you'll see some of those portraits here. So working with the illustrator Richard A. Chance, we translated these images into illustrations that kind of highlight connections between the park and the lives of the participating residents. So you can see a couple of the portraits here. But as we're scrolling through these, one thing we want to mention, I think what's interesting about this kind of work really has to do with the negotiations and the acts of exchange that are necessary to pull off a project like this. And the whole project kind of becomes a co-creation, something we call co-design, which has really been something that is increasingly important to our practice over the years.
So an important turning point for us in this kind of this process of the co-design was our project, a holding pattern. So we can go to the next slide. This was our 2011 installation for MoMA, and it was a temporary installation for the PS1 courtyard. And our design was based on many, many conversations with PS1's neighbors. And so we asked about 200 people and institutions in the neighborhood if there was anything that we could, if there was anything that they needed that we could design and use in PS1 over the summer and then deliver to them in the fall. You can see that kind of sequence at the top. These are the things that people asked for. Next slide, slide 85. And then next slide, here they are in the courtyard. And then next slide. And they were all tagged. And then next slide. And here you can see some of those spaces. And afterwards, these items, they went all over Queens. Next slide. So it really became a project that was much bigger than the installation itself. And so the installation was really the result of a conversation with many different people. And importantly, it became, the design itself became a setting for these conversations between people and institutions that typically don't interact. You could call it an architecture of confluence, Felipe, and where through the design of the courtyard and through the creative programming, we brought these different groups to the museum, groups that hadn't set foot in the museum before. So this was really an important project for us. It really was important for us in the way that we think about design with many different actors and stakeholders. And following this project, we increasingly designed places and objects specifically for the purpose of fostering interaction and to use our designed interventions to really rethink what community outreach is or could be. And so not the kind of like, boring or patronizing, or even you could call it extractive community outreach that one sees so often, but really a kind of eye-level dialogue that can bring new actors into the planning process and truly yield new ideas and new architectures.
So since then, we have designed a number of spaces and tools specifically to facilitate the processes, like here in Cambridge, where we worked on the comprehensive plan together with UTIL. And this is just an example of an object that we designed for that specifically as a conversational space, right? So there's this table that is has the shape of Cambridge, and stools to the shape of the city's neighborhoods that traveled around the city for many weeks as a site for people to indicate their path to work or to school, but also to start larger conversations around questions such as such as zoning. Really a kind of conversation starter if you would say that, to ease into questions of planning and zoning, not about disseminating information so much, not about extracting input, but to set up the conversation around topics of planning. A newspaper that comes along with that, right? To get feedback, to keep people updated on the planning process, but also to a certain degree to demystify planning, for example, explaining what zoning is and how it works in a fun way. So those are some of the tools, a couple of games, right? Tabletop games, corridor game, a right-of-way game. Games, generally useful tool for people to engage with issues such as zoning, land use planning, concepts that are often really cloaked in abstract technical terms, right? But that don't need to be that way, right? As planners and designers and architects, we use so many tools such as drawings and models to develop design together. And the question is for us, can we use those tools also to bring in other actors into those conversations? Here again, the model game we developed for the city of Detroit to discuss questions of zoning in the context of the development of the new comprehensive zoning plan for Detroit. It's called the Game of Zones. A name that probably won't have such a long, will reach its expiration dates fairly soon. This is part of the Game of Zones, again, an illustration that we worked on with our frequent collaborator, Lessa Gonzalez, as a way of talking about zoning and questions of zoning in forms that are different from the zoning plan, namely here the graphic novel, tools from the graphic novel. Finally, another table. We developed a table and another game. So this is for a large project that's going on currently in Antwerp, where we're part of a team that's developing a plan for one of 5 segments for the highway that's surrounding the city of Antwerp. So it's a large infrastructure project, like a kind of big dick scale project that of course requires a lot of technical expertise. But aside from these questions of how do you pull off a project like this, there are also high-level questions about a project that everybody in the city can have an opinion about and can make an argument on, such as, given the limited budget of this project, which part of this 12-kilometer highway should be covered first and what should happen on the deck. And so these are questions that we can, should bring into the public realm, again, in the form here of this table, a game table that was set up in youth centers around the city, bringing those questions really to publics, to constituencies that are typically outside of those planning questions, right? Which is always, of course, an issue of community planning meetings, project meetings, that only those people show up who are in the know. And this is certainly the case in Antwerp, right? And so this was a deliberate effort to use the medium of the game and to have a table that travels to community centers and to constituencies that outside of the process, particularly youngsters, right? Particularly for neighborhoods that are adjacent to this infrastructure project, and but that were not part of this discussion.
I promise this is the last table we'll talk about, but it's an important table. This is one that we use to develop a design project, which is a nature playscape, and we use this to design with our clients, namely the youths of St. Louis. And so the project that we use this table for is an 18-acre playscape in St. Louis as far as park. It's presently under construction, and the scheme here, as you can see, is a kind of pearl on a necklace scheme, and we're linking play areas, each based on different a different ecological theme with an ADA accessible path. So for example, there's a gravel bank with rocks and streams, which you'll see. In the next slide, you'll see a wetland. Here's a wetland and so on. So you kind of get the idea. Now, this being a place for kids, we enlisted a lot of kids to help us design it. And we wanted to use the engagement to make kind of co-authors of youth populations that were underrepresented in Forest Park. The idea being that people who help design something are more likely to visit something. So we made a kind of wish list of different diverse places in the city and basically hit the road with our table. There you go, the next slide. Next. So what did we do with this table? Well, we had a color forms activity, for example. We asked kids to kind of pick from one of 5 backgrounds, pictures of the site, and we gave them a sticker book, and the prompt was basically make something that looks like fun. So you'll see some examples on the subsequent slides. We also had a 3D version of this activity, which you'll see in the next slide. We gave kids kind of 3D versions of the backgrounds, and they ran wild with that. Our next step in the next slide was to really translate the ideas and the feedback we got. So we picked out some themes and we singled out some of our favorite ideas, as you can see in the sketch. And then the next step was really to evaluate our sketches. And we formed a youth advisory committee. And we asked them to kind of evaluate our interpretations. Did we get it right? You know, if we were to build these things that you collaged, how could they be even more fun? So we went out, we prototyped some of these sketches, advisory committee tested them. And then so, you know, next slide, in the collages that you saw before, most of them are composed of crazy things that kids collaged. I mean, the idea was that these kids were gonna think of things that were crazier and more fun than anything we would ever think of. We were right about that. And so in the next slide, this is from our virtual construction management session. You see some of this stuff just being built. We had better pictures, but that'll suffice for now. And then, you know, finally, we designed interpretive signage. So if you see in the next slide, you know, right now we've got kids all over St. Louis kind of learning about these different ecological areas and in turn teaching other kids about them. So in the next slide, you'll see the kind of plan for these signs, really to just stick them in the ground, right? They're gonna tell other kids what to look out for, like turtles, or what something might become, or whatever. It's a big effort, but you know, I think in some it's really about doing community outreach. That's not just about checking a box. It's about tapping into expertise, and it's about multi-voice design. Next slide.
Sorry. So these were some examples of small-scale design projects that were really about the design process itself, opening it up, bringing new actors and new voices into the process, with the goal of, you know, ultimately achieving better, more interesting, more complex, more resilient projects that are based on many different ideas and experiences, but also really to harness the design process itself as an opportunity for conversation, for education and empowerment. And so really trying to widen the conversation and opening up the process as much as possible, and in that way contribute to public discourse. And so I want to show you now how that plays out at the larger scale. This is a neighborhood plan one that in Detroit. And this really builds on our earlier work, the Blot project that Tobias showed you at first. But since then, we have been doing a number of different projects for the city, for the PDD department, Planning Development Department. And this project I'm going to show you now is the Campo Bangladesh Davison neighborhood plan. And this is a neighborhood, or you could call it a collection of neighborhoods in northern Detroit that is really marked by stark discrepancy. Some parts of the neighborhood have a lot of vacancy, which you can see kind of in the upper right and the lower left in the orange and blue areas. But then in other areas, like in the middle, there's a lot of reinvestment and development going on, much of it driven by the Bangladeshi immigrant community. And initially, some Bengali immigrants came to this neighborhood from Queens, Queens in New York a couple decades ago. And now it's really the place where people want to go if they arrive from Bangladesh, because it has all of the commercial and religious and support infrastructure that to support you every day.
Okay, sorry, I was on mute there. So there's a lot of redevelopment in some parts of the neighborhood of this area, but the western and northern parts of the planning area are still marked by disinvestment and a lot of vacancy. Here we see the part of Davison Village. So what we see here in green are vacant city-owned parcels. So this is all currently owned by the land bank. So you see a large percentage of that neighborhood is land bank owned. And of course, the question is, what do we do with all this land that that the city currently owns? So we proposed here kind of patchwork of approaches with a couple of areas where we said these are sites for future green infrastructure that the city should hold for future infrastructure projects, to reserve parcels that are at that are plots, basically, where residents have taken on land next to their homes. 3, reserve land that is currently stewarded, meaning someone is taking care of the land in a sort of light way, without owning title to it. And then 4, bundle the remaining parcels together and sell or give to groups in the community, to groups that require larger bundles of land. So you see the inventory of those resulting parcels. Those are perfect, and this is sort of the patchwork of approaches, but those larger bundles are really useful for organizations that are working in a neighborhood like this one. This is Bantu Garden, a cooperative of Bengali women who had quite a bit of success selling produce from their gardens or from the collection of their gardens in their backyards, and who recently acquired 7 vacant parcels in this area to expand their business and eventually set up an industrial kitchen.
So these are community groups that have a real stake in the ground, and they'll benefit from this, the bundling program. But we can also find here a lighter form of land tenure, one that's less permanent, and characterized more by use value than, and like say seasonal use, care and maintenance. These are the remaining residents who are taking care of vacant land outside of the territory they own. They mow the lawn, they clean up trash, sometimes they grow things like Moten here. And they do this maybe because they have some interest in the land further down the line, or maybe they're just being good neighbors. But our position was that they should have some stake in the future of the land. And as Tobias showed, it's really prevalent. And if we just zoom in here and look at a detail of that, you can see that Marty has a blot, but then he also takes care of the Detroit Land Bank next door and across the street. And so what you see here are the kind of clear boundaries of property. They're becoming blurry, and another form of land tenure is introduced, a kind of informal, let's call it a land tenure light. And because this form of land tenure is informal, you can't find it on a cadastral map. The city definitely doesn't give it to you as a GIS layer at the beginning of the project, but you also can't find it by looking closely the way you can see blots. The only way to get this information is by talking to people, acquiring local knowledge in meetings. We had many, many meetings, focus groups, smaller meetings such as women's meeting, model building, and game sessions. But we also had conversations in more informal settings. This is not a table, it's an ice cream truck, but I think it does kind of a similar thing. We had it doing rounds in the neighborhood over the summer, and it doubled as a neighborhood map and a kind of engagement station, a conversation starter, where you could sort of say that we're ice cream in exchange for information. And so we chose the ice cream truck as a medium because, like so much of Detroit, this neighborhood is really spread out and car-based, and the ice cream truck is a really important and kind of ubiquitous piece of urban infrastructure, kind of familiar mobile setting for conversations, for exchanges of ideas, and for ice cream cones. So that's it.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for to the three of you for really a fantastic fantastic lecture. And we're going to open it up to questions in a second, but I would want to start with just one question, which sort of ties back to the theme of the lecture series, this idea of an architecture of confluence, right? An architecture of confluence is an ideal, and certain projects sort of reach that ideal more than others. And one thing that for me is, I've always known, but now I see it sort of in your work more directly, is that in many ways you've developed a made to measure design strategy so you've designed urban planning processes and created a framework that allows for people to come together in quite a unique, creative, and in many ways fun way. You've made urban planning very fun. But my question is, what happens when the multi-voices that are part of your project don't agree? Many voices, not all voices are equal, and some speak louder, fiscally, politically. How do you address contestation within your process?
I don't, Tobias, are you speaking?
I'm not,
maybe I'll
but
jump
I can.
in.
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, maybe I'll jump in and just, I mean, that's a great question, Felipe, and it's not one that's easy to answer. And I don't think we would ever claim to have all of the answers. But I think that in a way, we're not trying to necessarily smooth out those contestations. And I think in many cases, we've actually tried to make use of them. And like, we didn't talk about it in detail, but I think it was in the section that Tobias gave on some of the early public spaces. There was the one project, Lens Space, where we did this sculpture park in Lower Manhattan. And in that project, we had a very small budget, and we were trying to create this setting for sculpture, and the landowner insisted that we put a fence around the whole parcel. And we thought that was a really bad idea for public space. But no matter how many great arguments that we gave, and no matter how many times we tried to sort of say that, you know, our idea was better, we decided to actually see if we could work with the idea of the fence, and then we ended up with this pivoting fence, which, as it pivots, because it actually creates different kinds of spaces. And actually, in that project, a security consultant told us that the fence actually couldn't be, you had to be able to see through it. So then we actually cut a window in it, and then we put a bench on it. And so we tried to work with that element that was like the object of contestation, and to use it as the kind of the beginnings of a new design idea. And I think that that's what we're trying to do in all of our projects, where by like putting those different things together, that you come up with something new. And I think like another way that you could talk about it is like the role of the designer is really like a matchmaker, where you put two things together that you couldn't think possibly would work, but then you put them together and you get something new. So I don't want to like minimize, because we've also, I mean, we've been in you know, situations where it hasn't, you know, totally worked out perfectly, but I think that, and I don't want to like minimize the kind of the problem of contestation, especially the world in which we're living right now. But I think that we try to see how you can put those things together in unexpected ways and bring people together as a way to start a conversation.
Please go ahead.
So, no, I was just going to add to that also that that's of course always the risk, right? That's in any kind of conversation or democratic processes. It's not, the result is not it's not about solving necessarily a conflict. At least there's a risk that you won't be able to do it. I think what we, in those projects that you mentioned, where we're using the tools of design to help in larger processes, right? So those projects where we design, say, an object in order to set the frame for a conversation about a larger infrastructure project. I think we're doing so we're trying to do so in two ways. One, really design things that are inviting to have those conversations, right? So that we can think of, again, as community engagement as more than extracting information or disseminating information, but as conversations. And two, so actually the designed objects, but two, I think there's as designers, we all as architects and planners have certain protocols, right? Certain ways in which we discuss ideas, typically in the studio, in the architecture school even, or in the office, the way we sit around a model and discuss it, or we sketch together. Those are, we think, really useful, obviously we all think really useful and great formats for having a discussion around topics, a future plan, we look together, we sit around a plan together and discuss it. And if we as a discipline have those protocols in place, those methods, tools to shape conversations, are there ways for us as planners and designers to open that up a little bit, to make those protocols available to a larger group of constituents, to a larger audience, to actors who are not typically part of those conversations, right? So those are the kind of two ambitions. Is use the design itself, the design object, as an invitation, and to open up some of the protocols and tools for discussion we have developed as a discipline to larger audiences. If that leads to a consensus or not, that is sort of an open question, like every form of democratic discourse.
Which will depend project by project, but I agree. I think that the thing that's fascinating is sort of this idea of taking the studio table into the context of the public forum, and in many ways making people participant and accountable also for many that take place. I think with that, we can actually open for questions from the audience. You can either type your question, you can also raise your hand virtually. If you raise it physically, I won't be able to see you. And we'll go both through questions that are typed and raise hands. So Luciana has raised her hand. Please, what's your question?
Hi, I'm an architect and urban designer from Brazil. I've been living in the US for 15 years, and I'm a big fan of you guys' work. I think your work is amazing. It's definitely inspiration. I currently teach at USC School of Architecture, and I think one of the biggest questions that I see also as an urban designer is, I have a studio now, a comprehensive studio where we are work with an African-American neighborhood, and we have a social justice center, but it's also a comprehensive studio that we have to put a lot of things, check boxes, right, in terms of building systems and all that. But beside the whole, I think, controversial of the studio itself, I think the biggest question is that when we are thinking about the approach from urban design to architecture, for me, it seems that it's much more clear those ideas of community participation becoming a conversation and a discussion that triggers design, and then suddenly something is being able to happen, be temporarily or more permanent. But I think my question is like, how do you do that with architecture? Because I think it has a different framework that, for me, who work in both fields, I feel that it can be more solid or something. So how do you break the similar barriers that we can do in the urban realm in architecture with a similar approach or framework? I want to just hear a little bit from you guys. How do you see that translation into architecture, from urban design into architecture?
I think that's for one of the two architects on the panel here. That would be either Georgeen or Tobias.
I think it's really a question about how we actually define architecture. I know what your question, I think I understand your question. And I think, but I think that what we're trying to do is to broaden the boundaries of how we define architecture. And so, for example, like some of those public space projects, I would consider them to be architectural, like the one I was just describing before, the one of the fence. I mean, we're still using the tools of architecture and building an actual physical artifact. I think that I think that what we're arguing for here is a kind of a rescoping of what the architect does.
But also maybe more broadly, the sort of form making in the project that Dan showed of the Forest Park playscapes, right, which was really set up as a sort of experiment. Not only how do you bring kids on board in the process and have discuss larger ideas, but also how do you make form with multiple voices, right? And some of the results to create that direct line. I think that's something that we're really dealing with a lot and discussing a lot, and it's really hard, right, to even find a project or client who's willing to go along with a process where we really say, we don't want this detached situation of some input and then the specialists go ahead and design the building or the park or the public space, right? But how can you bring that along, and how can you really be serious about an aesthetic of form making that incorporates or talks to different voices and things that might surprise us as designers, as we have, and I think you probably saw that in many of the projects. We have a very clear idea about what things should look like, right? But how can that be challenged by other input, and how can that translate into the final result and make the thing actually more complex, or at least talking to multiple voices in that way? I think that's such an interesting challenge, right? If you accept the proposition that getting different voices into the process, and to see what is the designed object, what is the form at the end, how does that still read out of that form? I think that's such an interesting way to think about design with many actors involved, including those that are not professional designers, right? So that Dan, you can speak to that better than I do. But if the kid in the end goes to this park and sees this kind of form and recognizes the earlier model right in there, that's I think such a strength in that project.
I mean, the only thing I would add is to say you know, in every project, you have to decide like how you're going to do engagement and what you're looking for, and it almost doesn't matter if it's architecture or planning or landscape architecture, because what you're always trying to do is find the best place to solicit meaningful input. So in that project that we talked about, you know, the Forest Park project, you know, in the beginning, a lot of our ideas that were around kind of engaging students around some of the ecology of the site. But at the end of the day, you know, the the big scheme that we would have half the site be a kind of forested area and a kind of half the site be a prairie restoration, and we'd have this ADA path connecting these activity areas. In a way, that didn't come out of the community engagement process, but what we realized was that there's this huge opportunity to do something that, to have kids do something that they were better at than us, namely imagining amazing things to play on, right? So I think and as Tobias is saying, what was great about that was not only that we were able to use the collages that they made to just say, oh, that's, we would never come up with that, but that seems buildable, let's do it. That by doing that, kids get to come to the park and see that they had a major hand in designing it in a very direct way. Those kids can come back and say, that crazy thing with the rocks, with the tree on top of it, with the rope coming across, like, that was mine. And I think that's what's exciting. In every project, I think we try to find that opportunity to do something really direct, where people could see that their time that they put into the design was worth it.
But I think,
Can I say one? I feel, Felipe, may I just say one thing? Because I feel like it was such a beautifully presented question. I didn't really answer it directly. But I think one thing also to say is that we're really trying hard to bring those processes of co-design into more straightforward architecture projects. But I think that it has to be, where we've had the most success doing that is when the process and the outcome is not clearly defined, and we've found like kind of wiggle room to do that, because I think that if you look at a lot of the ways that traditional architecture projects are framed, with like, say, your schematic design and then your design development, like there's really, like, when there's a much more kind of linear path of design, and when there's like a real kind of stress on the economy of that kind of critical path, it's been harder to do. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we've had these other projects where there's a little bit more, when, like, say, for example, projects that have to do with resiliency and sea level rise, where people don't know exactly what the outcome is, we've had more success in bringing that kind of co-design and also the redesign of the process into the project. Sorry, Flip, I didn't mean to.
No, I was because I was just going to guide sort of the conversation to the next question, which in many ways ties to what Dan and you were just saying. It says more specifically and on the same subject, but I think this was from a subject a while back because the question has been here for a while. The arsenal of inclusion and exclusion includes many examples of defensive architecture. What do you do when the urban conditions mean that there are real concerns for community members around installing, for example, seating in public spaces? How can you both listen to community experts without compromising your own design politics approach? Community in relation to sort of disciplinary expertise.
Well, I think this actually goes back to the same things that we're talking about. I would point to the project that we just completed in the South Bronx, the temporary cooling station, where there are like major issues around security. There's zero money for maintenance. It's in a kind of an environment where sometimes things get very heavily used or sometimes vandalized. And I think that with that project, what we tried to do was look at all of those different perspectives, and then like initially we were going to put everything in the middle of the street, but then we realized that there was this fence and that we could attach everything to the fence, and then it would actually be protected, but then also still could give off the mist and the light and blow the air that we wanted to. So I mean, in a way, I think that's really what design thinking is. Like when you look at all these kind of different conditions and you think about how to put them together in a way that's unexpected and addresses the kind of constraints, but does it in a way that's unexpected.
And I would add to that maybe the question of the defensive architecture, I think that's a really good question, right? But one that I think we're all as architects confronted and planners confronted with, right? Sort of our ambition to work in a process that involves different voices of client in a narrower or wider sense, and our own, convictions and politics, which might be in conflict sometimes, right? And that's not only the case if the community or the public is your client, but that is the case with every client in every project. And we can see how long we can compromise and at which point we have to walk, right? That's sort of a question I think that every architect confronts. I think the ambition of the arsenal then also is to maybe make that a clearer connection between designed objects and the hidden meaning in them, so that it actually becomes harder in some cases for people to argue for certain elements in public spaces without admitting to the fact that that it's really about keeping some people out of the public space, right? But so that is perhaps the idea of bringing that out into the open. But again, we can't resolve or don't have a method for resolving those conflicts beyond perhaps educating to a degree that this is that the arsenal does that, and having our stance in a conversation that again involves many different constituents and therefore different voices.
Yeah. We have actually a great question that was sent just to me, but it's addressed to you by Matthias Hendy, and it actually says, how have individual or group projects that for some reason or another have not succeeded influenced how you view success in your work? And how has this changed the kind of projects you're willing, motivated to do?
I don't think we know. We've never failed, so it's hard to know. I can't think of a single example.
This is specifically towards the project of our projects that failed.
No, I think what Matthias is asking is basically what has worked, what hasn't, and how have you learned from your own process, right? Over time.
For me, you actually cut out there for a second. Can you just say the very last thing you said?
Yeah, I was saying basically throughout sort of the last 15 or 20 years, what are the processes that you've designed, right, in terms of engaging communities, et cetera, that you think have been most successful? Which are the we've had to tweak? Which are the ones that maybe didn't work as planned?
Yeah.
I think maybe sorry, go ahead.
Oh, good.
I was just going to say that I think that one thing, when we first started working, we did everything really locally, and we spent very, very long time in each place. And as we have grown, we have done projects in different places, and we've done more projects. And I think one of the questions that we've thought about a lot is the kind of not only the kind of the before and the during the project, but after the project, and what it means to do engagement in a place, and then what happens when the project is over. And so I think one of the things that we have done more recently is that we've expanded our teams. Like in the Campo Banglatown project, one of our team members that we did all the engagement with was a resident who lives in the neighborhood. She's a performing artist, and she was our partner, and she was there throughout the whole thing, but then she still lives in the neighborhood. And I think that that's something that I think that we have been thinking about and working on as we've done more projects in different places with shorter timeframes, how to not be a kind of like helicopter firm that sort of comes in and then goes out afterwards, and what does it really mean to do engagement that is with real ties. I think any office that does work like that has to ask that question, and I don't think it's really been asked enough in practice.
Which in many ways has to do with how you sort of in relationships over time. How do you actually sort of go back and revisit, I guess, certain things that that help shape the project to begin with.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? No, I have. If there are no more questions, I have one last question before we close. And I think for me, it has to do with your role as educators, but I don't mean educators in the academy. I think one of the greatest things about your to this is that you actually take the academy. If André Malraux argued for the museum without walls in Paris, you are arguing for sort of the academy without walls and community, right? Not only are you pushing a project forward, but I think you're also bringing people together that are learning significantly in the process. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about this aspect, about not just bring people together to address a specific issue, but bring people together as opportunities to establish new networks, new connections, new futures for many constituencies.
Could I, Felipe, am I able to add to that question just a little bit?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So
I'm very impressed with your hike during the lecture, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I got a really good data plan. So
please go ahead.
It's pretty surreal. Anyway, so yeah, I don't mean to take too much time. So I thought it was interesting. So this is adding to what Felipe is saying, and I thought it was interesting how Georgeen
Iggy, you bragged
was mentioning that. Yep.
We lost you just after you bragged about your data plan. So start.
Oh no,
now.
That's embarrassing. Am I back?
You're back, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, that's embarrassing. So the only thing that I wanted to add on to Felipe's question was I was interested by Georgeen's characterization that while your office is designing, there's sort of a desire for the unexpected, right? Or you like it, and obviously everyone does. And I wonder if you've thought about that a little bit more deeply, in the sense that when you design and if you give it critical thought, the product is usually unexpected. But while you're doing it, how conscious are you, and how aware do you make the community that they're kind of participating in something that no one will know what the product will be?
I think that hi Iggy, nice to see you.
Hey, nice to see you.
And thank you, Felipe. Those are two good questions to try to make into one. I would say that for us, I think I speak for all of us when I say one of our favorite things about what we do is the fact that what we do always keeps us guessing and keeps us surprised. One of the reasons why we bring a lot of people to the table, one of the reasons why we make sure that when we do engagement, we reach youths and seniors and everyone in between, is because it's very interesting to us to see how different people think about the same space, right? And you know, one of the things we did when we were working in Cambridge is we would do a feature for our newspaper where we would walk around the same block in Central Square with really different people. And we would just annotate the walk, right? Just to see the different perspectives or lenses that people had on this walk. These can be people who were different because they were different ages or different races, or because some were housed and some weren't, or because there were people who did historic preservation, right? And it's endlessly fascinating to us just to understand that and to use that material to constantly check our own biases, our own assumptions, our own prejudices and beliefs about what we think is good or works. And so that's one of the reasons why I think we bring people to around the same table. It's not just for our own, intellectual amusement. I mean, it's that, and I think that's something that keeps us engaged. But it's also more importantly, because you realize how complicated what we do is, how many implications there are, how many opinions there are, and how many different voices you should really consider before you make decisions about land use or architecture or anything in between, right? So to me, that's really, I'll also say something that we do that's worked, just to go back to the previous question, throughout, there are a lot of things that we've learned and things we've done that haven't worked. But I would say from the beginning, we've always had that kind of curiosity and that kind of interest in just the weird cacophony of ideas and opinions about how spaces work or should look or how tall they should be or whatever.
I think that's a very sort of a great way to end the lecture and the conversation. But sort of before we do that, a huge thank you to the three of you. An incredible sort of a body of work and an even more enriching conversation following. I look forward to having another a conversation, maybe not in 15 years. We need to do it every 5 years now, since sort of the work is multiplying quicker. But of course, always a treat to have you at UVA. And we look forward to having you in person. We owe you a post-lecture dinner that we, of course, will have at some point in the future.
Thank you, Felipe.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Oh, one quick point. There was a question at the beginning. Somebody was asking, where can they get a copy of the Arsenal book?
It's sold out, but the second edition, a paperback edition, is in the works now. And I don't want to jinx anything, but soon. It'll be out soon.
Very good. Well, thank you. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.